Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to IM A-Star ANFSN Webinar 2020. I'm Sangeeta Sham.
Hi, I'm Megan Chong, who will be your moderator for today.
Before we start, let me just remind you of some housekeeping rules. We have muted the microphones for all attendees. For questions and feedback, please use the Q&A panel, and this live talk session will be recorded. This webinar is a collaborative effort of the International Medical University Center for Transformative Nutrition and Health, CTNH, A-Star Singapore, and the ASEAN Nutrition and Food Science Network, ANFSN. ANFSN was set up in 2019 to bring together scientists and professionals working across various disciplines of nutrition and food science in Southeast Asia. The goal for ANFSN is to initiate, foster, and sustain multidisciplinary collaborations to advance research and achieve wider impact in public health through innovation. The network is coordinated by researchers at the earlier stages of their career and supported by those more established in their field. Early career researchers from Singapore and Malaysia were the pioneering batch of ANFSN alumni in 2019. And this year, we have our friends from Thailand and Indonesia who are joining us today through this webinar.
In today's webinar, we will seek answers to important and urgent questions that's relevant to us, especially as nutritionists, food scientists, and dietitians. Can sustainable nutrition be healthy and affordable? Without much ado, we'd like to invite Professor Dr. Winnie Chi, Dean of the School of Health Sciences, International Medical University, to give the welcome address and the opening remarks. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Megan, and good afternoon to everyone. Good afternoon to our distinguished speakers, Professor Paul Teng, Dr. Yasmin, Mr. Ashok Vasudevan, Mr. Azran, Osman, Rani, and of course, Professor Jaya Henry, my IMU colleagues, and all participants from wherever you are. Welcome, and it is a great pleasure for me to welcome you to the Asian Nutrition and Food Science Network webinar. Now, all great things begin with an idea, a vision, and a dream. Professor Jaya Henry had the vision that we need to bring together young scientists in food and nutrition in a platform that can nurture them, ignite their creativity, and foster collaboration. In parallel, it is IMU's dream to be able to contribute significantly to improving human health through nutrition and dietetics. So began the formation of IMU Center for Transformative Nutrition and Health about a year ago, and our collaboration with Professor Jaya Henry from A-Star Singapore. Now, CTNH aspires to contribute to the nutrition and dietetics field through education and training, research, and service. And in the past 1 year since our inception, we have fostered collaborations with formidable partners, including A-Star, Naluri, Simeo Rakfon, and our industry partners. So it gives me great pleasure to congratulate my colleagues in IMU, whom from this seed of an idea, from this vision and this dream, they have collaborated with the wonderful team at A-Star to bring you this webinar. The theme is also very appropriate and timely, where discussions about nutrition can no longer ignore the word sustainability. Today, more than ever, in the face of nutrition issues such as food insecurity, malnutrition, obesity, and the role of the food environment, there is a need to discuss sustainable nutrition, including producing foods with low environmental impact, which elevates food and nutrition security and allow our present and future generation to lead a healthy life. In this aspect, we need innovation, and we look forward to listen to our eminent speakers today who will discuss the role of innovation in ensuring sustainable nutrition, and also inspire scientists out there in our webinar who are working in food and nutrition. We hope you'll be able to obtain ideas for research, for advocacy, and for implementation. We are very pleased indeed that we've received tremendous support from across the Asian countries, having more than 200 participants who actually registered for this webinar. And right now I can see we've got more than 100 participants tuned in already. So on behalf of the organizing committee, I sincerely hope we will all enjoy the discussion and the networking online today. So with that, I thank you very much, and let's all enjoy the webinar as we start. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Vinny. We have with us 4 eminent panelists to deliberate on today's theme of sustainable nutrition from various perspectives. More importantly, they will also share with us some glimpses of their journey that got them to where they are. They will also share their thoughts on innovation and mentoring in building capacity for the up and coming, drawing upon their individual rich experiences. The speakers will address questions from the audience at the panel discussion after all 4 speakers have completed their presentations. We request the audience to share your questions in the Q&A box. We now invite Professor Dr. Paul Teng to talk to us about harnessing technology to achieve sustainable nutrition. Professor Paul Teng is the Dean and Managing Director, National Institute of Education International, Singapore. Professor Teng needs no introduction to those working in the area of food security. He is a regular invited speaker on agricultural biotechnology, teaching global audience on ways to bring products from the lab to the consumer. Recently, he has devoted his time to researching science communication and science entrepreneurship under the umbrella of innovation and enterprise to meet the needs of the new economies. Professor Teng has received several accolades and shoulders many responsibilities at the national and international levels. He has also been a regular consultant for the FAO, the World Bank, and several other international and regional organizations. Among the many awards that he has received is the Ericsson Prize in Plant Pathology, awarded by the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. For his contributions to food security, Professor Teng was awarded an Honorary Doctor of Science by Murdoch University, Australia. We are honored to have you with us today, Professor Teng. Prof. Teng, the stage is now all yours.
Thank you very much, Sangeeta. Let me just share my slides. Okay. Can I just confirm that you can see my slides?
Prof. Teng, we are able to see your slides. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Also, first of all, let me thank the organizers for this opportunity to talk to you about 2 very important topics, as mentioned by Rani. The technology and nutrition. What I hope to cover really is to kind of point you to some important challenges that are facing us to sustain proper nutrition, and then leading them to the kind of a need for a food systems approach to tackle nutrition. And of course, the gist of my presentation will focus on technologies, especially disruptive technologies that can contribute to ensure healthy, affordable, and nutritious food. What I will not attempt to do is to define sustainability, because there's no common accepted definition of sustainability yet. Suffice to say though that, you can't talk about nutrition without talking about the bigger picture, which is food security. So I want to put to you that nutrition security really is an integral part of food security. And that's the context within which we need to view nutrition. Let me share with you, first of all, this Global Food Security Index, or GFSI, that's published annually by the Economist Intelligence Unit. You will see in this slide here that ASEAN countries, most of them actually don't do too badly. When in the top kind of 50 or 60 of countries in terms of being food secure. And this index is based on the rubrics of availability of food, affordability, quality and safety, and then natural resources and resilience. However, if we look a bit deeper, try and unpack the figures, then we can see that ASEAN indeed, even though ASEAN is such a vibrant economic region, according to the FAO last year's report, about 9.2% of ASEAN population is undernourished. And about 20.4% of our people here are in moderate to severe food insecurity. So you can see the 2 phases that we have in ASEAN, right? On the one hand, spectacular economic growth, and on the other hand, still the presence of significant undernutrition and also significant food insecurity. Now, if we take a closer look at ASEAN, ASEAN is urbanizing very fast. We're already over 50% urban, and we have about over 250 million middle class. What these 2 particular trends mean is that they're also driving other trends in food and diet. It's obvious to many of us who study this area that the food demands have changed a lot in Southeast Asia. more food is now purchased by working families, especially in the urban areas. There's also reduced per capita consumption of rice. And in this case, we follow, in fact, what's happening in countries like Korea, where the Koreans are eating half as much rice now as they used to. There's increased consumption per capita of wheat and wheat-based products in place of rice. There's also increased diversity in the food groups consumed, and some of these food groups come from far, far away, very high energy miles indeed to bring the food to ASEAN, especially from the temperate zone areas where some of these products in fact can be considered luxury products. There's also rising popularity of convenience food and beverages, what some folks have called the westernization of diets. And of course, the rise in animal protein consumption is just amazing in this part of the world, as well as energy-dense diets. So what this really means is that ASEAN countries are undergoing a nutrition transition, a transition away from the old days when most of the diets were mainly plant-based diets that were low in fat and sugar. And what this also means is that, the way that we measure malnutrition nowadays also has to change quite a bit. In fact, I like what Dr. Fan Schengen has said about malnutrition. He says that we now face a triple burden of malnutrition, where, decades ago, we worried a lot about undernutrition, undernourishment, right? Stunting, wasting, underweight, and so on, which still occurs in the ASEAN region. But we worry now increasingly too about overnutrition, the unbalanced intake of food, resulting in obesity and also non-communicable diseases. And embedded in this, of course, are micronutrient deficiencies that are contributing to stunting, wasting, and underweight. And I particularly like this image up on the top right-hand corner of the screen that shows, human beings evolving because of diet. Suffice to say, ASEAN is among the regions with expected high increases in non-communicable diseases, especially things like diabetes, and over 20% increase expected by 2020. That's how serious the problem is. It's gotten so serious and so much public interest that even the Prime Minister of Singapore has come out to warn all of us about diabetes. That it's a hidden tsunami, basically, that we all have to watch out for. Now, there is an opportunity, I feel, to do something about undernourishment. It is very empirical that the countries that have higher GDP per capita tend to have lower incidences of malnutrition, and also that countries with higher GDP per capita tend to spend less of household incomes on food. Now, if you look at this, what you can reread to is that lower income households, in fact, spend a higher proportion of the income on food, but they also seem to have higher undernutrition. So obviously, improving livelihood is one very generic way to say that we can improve undernutrition and address malnutrition issues by improving livelihoods, income per household, basically. Now, all this really brings me to the next point, which is I think we really need what we call a food systems approach in nutrition. When we address sustainable nutrition issues, it is necessary to take a whole of system view. In other words, nutritionists need to talk to others in the food chain. And I particularly like this definition of what the food system is. In this particular case, it was a definition taken from the Economics and Intelligence Unit's publication about bringing together Asia's food systems. At its simplest, a food system covers end-to-end activities, from production to consumption, and even disposal and waste and so on. So I would actually, put to you all that I think it's necessary for us, irrespective of which part of the nutrition and food security, where basically they're saying that if you want to look at food, you've got to look at, first of all, where food is produced, which is agriculture, then what they call the food environments, which others have called the different dimensions of food security, and then the consumer himself or herself, going to diets, nutrition, health outcomes, and impact. All this together, in fact, constitutes the food system. That you cannot tackle nutrition issues in isolation from the rest of the food system. If there's anything I would like you to remember is this particular point, really, that the food systems approach is so necessary. And the FAO, the Agriculture Organization, and the WHO have also chipped in on this, saying that you have to promote healthy diets and reduce malnutrition, that you got to do it through agriculture and food systems. Indeed, today we know that, agriculture, the way we grow food, also determines the nutrition of the food we eat and ultimately health itself. Yeah. So the link, I think, is pretty obvious, and obviously the link between, food and health itself. So it's important to also recognize in this whole system that there are what I'm terming feed forward and also feedback links between agriculture, where food is produced, the raw materials to make food, the food preparation, and then the consumer food utilization. They're all really interlinked with feed forward and feedback mechanisms. Now, let me spend the last few minutes I have, talking about disruptive technologies. I'm a firm believer that in this modern world, technology can play a big role in addressing food security issues and also nutrition security issues. It's not by any means the only set of tools. There are many other tools as well, social and so on, but certainly disruptive technologies. Now, what do I mean by disruptive technologies? Disruptive technologies are really technologies that enable the world to produce food in sufficient quantities and quality in order to allow us to achieve sustainable nutrition. And I particularly like this definition by Clayton Christensen, a Harvard professor, what a disruptive technology means. And for those who are much younger in their career, you have great opportunities in this whole space to really come up with and innovate a new disruptive technology. So disruptive technology is one that displaces an established technology and shakes up the industry, or it's a groundbreaking product that creates a completely new industry. I only have time in this webinar to share with you 6 of these sets of disruptive technologies. The first set I would highlight is digital technology. And I think that's pretty obvious. A lot of folks talk about the 3rd industrial revolution, the 4th industrial revolution, and so on. And there's so much use of digital technology now, and yet food production, agriculture is amongst the least digitized industries compared to, let's say, airspace, the airline industry, the finance industry, and so on. Yeah. So lots of opportunities here for us to help grow more food. And in the context of sustainable nutrition, I would put it to you that digital technologies help us to ensure a plentiful supply of food. Because one of the basic tenets of sustainability is that you've got to have that supply, get a plentiful supply. So this is the first set of disruptive technologies. The second set is biotechnology. And this is not just talking about GMOs alone, it's talking about a whole suite of technologies, including nowadays gene editing biotechnologies. And going forward, in fact, the next generation, of gene editing technologies combined with other kinds of biotechnologies. And the products that we see, beyond the GMOs now, are finding wide applications. For example, the non-browning potato is one example where to reduce food waste. Okay, and then the golden rice, plus other enhanced sweet potatoes and so on, to increase vitamin A content in the food that we eat. And of course, climate adaptation is another, aspect that we have to deal with quite a bit, because climate does affect the plant health, nutrition of plant. So biotechnologies as a disruptive technology help us to ensure affordable and nutritious supplies of food in the context of sustainable nutrition. The third disruptive technology I will put to you is really what I've called controlled environment food farming, for want of a better, lump of technologies. And this is where increasingly now we're finding in the urban areas, urban farmers who farm under controlled environment conditions, where you can regulate basically your air, your light, intake of water and so on. And the beauty of this is that it is supposed to be climate neutral. In other words, irrespective of what happens to climate change, you can still maintain this same environment if you have the energy issue tackled. Yeah? And also, some of these farms do not use any pesticides because the environment is so controlled that no pests can get in. Okay? And it extends not just to vegetables, but to fish as well. So this is the set of disruptive technologies that I think are seeing now an increased uptake amongst urban areas, growing urban areas in Asia. In fact, Asia, as we know, has actually more than 400 of these urban vegetable farms now. And even Kuala Lumpur has one, I heard. Now, the next set really deals with a set of technologies that helps to preserve identity, prevent fraud. And this is an important aspect of sustainable nutrition. You need to know what you're eating. Okay? And there are many kinds of technologies being developed all around the world. The one that I particularly like is this one here called the iKnife, okay, which is a new technology, partly UK, partly Australia, where basically you can put this surgical knife in a piece of meat, and it can tell you exactly whether you're buying a genuine cord or genuine Wagyu beef or something else. Okay, the identity is verifiable, basically. Yeah. So what this kind of technologies allow us to do is to ensure safe and reliable food, which is another component of sustainable nutrition. Then we move on to the fifth one. And this fifth one deals with supply chains. Obviously, without supply chains, you don't have a source of food to talk about sustainability. And there are all kinds of, I would say, supply chain technologies available now, some of which use other technologies to ensure freshness, to reduce waste. We all know about e-commerce, and certainly COVID-19 has taught us how important e-commerce is. So this is a fast evolving area with both high-tech and not so high-tech in different parts of the world. And in ASEAN, we also see many examples of it. But this ensures a timely supply of food. Let me move on to the last one, last set of disruptive technologies, which I'm broadly calling novel food and novel food processing. Okay? This goes all the way from cellular meat, cell-based meat, to plant-based protein, to insect protein, to underutilized plants, to microbial protein. Okay? There's a whole mixture here, plus techniques. You see, in the old days, we used to say that food comes from agriculture. Going forward, we might say that food comes from the lab, basically, or from the food factory. Yeah. So this, in the context of sustainable nutrition, refers to alternative supplies of food, especially when we're under pressure, when there's no food that can come in or be bought. It's so important in any particular country, you have alternative supplies of food to give you that resilience that is so important in your food supply. Now, I don't want to claim that I've covered all the disruptive technologies in these few minutes, but these were the 6 that I thought I should be sharing with you. Let me finish off my 20 minutes by also saying that, in terms of adoption of some of these novel foods, like plant-based proteins, for example, some of this data that's been, in surveys conducted by different groups have shown that the uptake during COVID-19 has just been amazing. People are trying to find alternatives to animal protein, in this case, plant-based protein. Of course, in the context of sustainable nutrition, as researchers, the question we always have to ask is, what is the nutritive value of this plant-based protein? That's a very important question, of which I'm sure there will be answers in the future. So with that, let me thank the organizers again very much for this opportunity to share with you, and I'll look forward to questions later on. So thank you very much indeed for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Teng. That was fantastic presentation from you as usual, and it was very inspiring, and we have a lot of data that we need to look through and understand in totality. So when you did tell us about food coming in from the lab, I just remembered one of these researchers which said about kindergarten students saying that potatoes came from one of those fast food chains. So we are going to have some disruptive technologies, hopefully, to have some sustainable nutrition. So all questions to Professor Teng can be posted in the Q&A box, and Professor Teng will be able to answer them for you at the end of today's presentations. So
okay. We now invite Dr. Yasmin Ooi to present her talk titled Strategic Partnership to Ensure Food Security. Dr. Yasmin Ooi is a member of Malaysia's National Agricultural and Food Industry Advisory Board, as well as a technical working group on national dietary guidelines. She also coordinates Agri-Solutions for University Malaysia Sabah. It is a group of 40 researchers from various disciplines that look into innovative solutions to overcome food security issues from farm to plate. Agri-Solutions work with farmers in the community to solve issues brought about by the new normal of COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Yasmin Ooi, the stage is yours.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Megan, for the introduction, and thank you to the organizers for having me here today. I'd like to share with you some of the work that we are currently doing in our countries during the COVID-19 pandemic and what we could look forward going into the future after this pandemic season. So this is the outline of my talk. I'll talk to you a little bit about food security for those of us who don't have work in this field. And then I would like to share with you some of the background for food security during this COVID-19 pandemic. And then we will talk about effects of movement control orders. I'd like to focus on ASEAN countries. And then we would look at some of the strategic partnerships for food security that at the moment in our countries, some of the challenges that we currently face and the way forward. So food security, very briefly, this is the standard FAO WHO 4 pillars of food security. You have issues of availability, access, utilization, and stability. And of course, in societies where you have poverty, poverty leads to food insecurity, which in turn leads to hunger. And if this situation persists, then you will get malnutrition. And if malnutrition occurs in children, then the effects would be poor physical and cognitive development. This is where it gets dangerous, because with poor cognitive development, children are going to schools and not achieving their optimum potential. When they reach adulthood, they would be involved in low productivity manual jobs, or they would be participating in economic activities that have low returns, and then you'd get a perpetuation of the poverty cycle. Now, then that spanner in the works, you have the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's going to worsen all these factors and at the same time reduce availability, access, utilization, and stability. So in other words, going into the future, we do have pockets of increasing food insecurity, particularly in the most vulnerable parts of our society. So the way we were before COVID-19, this is European data, and we already know that fruits and vegetables, which constitute part of good nutritional quality, they are more expensive than other food groups. And I do apologize for the array of data here, but what I like to point out to you, please look at the boxes highlighted in red. So you have high income countries, low income countries, the values are RCPs. RCPs are relative caloric price. That's the ratio of the price of 1 calorie of a given food to the price of 1 calorie of a representative basket of starchy staple food in each country. So in layperson speak, that would mean how much does these food items cost in comparison to what you would have bought if you have very little money and you need to satisfy your hunger. So if you look further down here where my mouse is, that is Southeast Asia. Southeast Asian RCPs are about the same level as low-income countries. So although we would like to think that our respective countries are improving, we are quite far away from the food security levels of high-income countries for all these food items. And then you have China and India, so they're slightly better off. They're Asian countries, and they are the two most populous nations on earth. So if you'd like to compare, then that's the nearest comparison that you could make. So let's talk about the preferred marketing channels for fresh agriculture produce. Marketing channels are important because that's how most people access their fresh agriculture produce. This is data from Peninsular Malaysia. As you could see, most people do not buy their foods from supermarkets and hypermarkets. Now, why these two establishments are important, we'll see more of that later. So the red boxes show where these establishments were closed during the MCOs. Now, MCOs, every country in Southeast Asia have different terminologies. Singapore calls it circuit breaker. Malaysia calls it movement control orders. Other countries in their respective national languages have different terminologies. But what they essentially mean is they focus on controlling public movement so that we could better mitigate the infection rates. So during the MCO, these usual channels of marketing for fresh agriculture produce were closed. Only supermarkets and hypermarkets remained open. The similar situation you see in Thailand. Most Thais would get their fresh agriculture produce from traditional markets. The similar situation in Indonesia. So this is the overall GFSI score. Professor Paul just now elaborated on this, so I think I could skip over that, but I'd like to just point out to you some patterns. So this is Singapore, as expected, with its high GDP and very good marketing networks and channels. It is very good. Now, I've put in blue for comparison purposes, New Zealand, Asia Pacific country, agriculture country, USA, a long-term highly developed economy, one of the major agriculture countries in the world, China and India, two of the most populous nations on earth, themselves Asian countries. And you'd wonder why I put Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is interesting because of its geography and topography. So Saudi Arabia is a very dry country, it's full of, almost the entire country is made of desert, and they have a growing population. But let's see how countries compare, how Southeast Asian countries compare. So in terms of affordability, it's nothing new. In terms of availability, this is what we expect. So in terms of quality and safety, Singapore and Malaysia seem to be doing rather well because there is very effective control of food quality standards by the respective health authorities. Then we come to this story, natural resources and resilience. So Singapore is doing just as well, or unfortunately, just not as well as Saudi Arabia. And that's because these two countries have very little arable land for agriculture. But as Professor Paul have pointed out just now, Singapore is investing very heavily in vertical agriculture, controlled environment agriculture. Saudi Arabia is investing very heavily on arid agriculture, so how to produce the most amount of fresh produce from the least amount of water. And New Zealand is one of the best performing countries in the world. In fact, the other country which performed very well was Finland. So, and we all know why, because New Zealand has large tracts of very arable land, very suitable climate, and I would not seek to define what is sustainability because that would be opening another topic of discussion. But we could all agree that in terms of farming and agriculture, New Zealand does it rather well in terms of sustainability measures. So this is the timeline of various movement control orders in ASEAN countries. They range from anywhere between 15 days on average to about slightly over a month or a month and a half. So what is the effect of these movement control orders? I don't think I would have time to elaborate on this, but this would be the trend from previous years. But if anyone is interested to talk about that, then we could take some questions during the Q&A. But I'd like you to look at this. Roughly, in all 10 ASEAN countries, movement control orders began in March 2020. And one crop cycle is about 2 to 3 months. Most of our farmers are smallholder farmers, and they plant, each crop cycle would be about 2 to 3 months. So what happened is the food supply chain was largely broken. And because of that, initially, there was a glut of fresh produce which cannot be sold, which cannot reach consumers. And one crop cycle later, these smallholder farmers could not have the resilience to replant because they are not sure whether they would be able to sell their produce. And because of that, you have falling stockpiles of fresh produce, and you see a trend in increasing food prices. So who farm our fresh produce in Southeast Asia? Globally, in developing countries, smallholders produce up to 80% of food consumed. Take a country in Southeast Asia, for example, Malaysia, 97% of fruits and vegetables are produced by smallholders on land less than 1 hectare. Smallholder farmers ensure social stability because they give employment or they give jobs, they provide an income to the most number of people. However, their interests are not always well represented. So there is a need to balance increase of smallholder livelihoods via exporting to high-income neighboring countries versus local food security. These are the effects of movement control orders. Like I said just now, I'll run through the chronology of events. Smallholder farmers had trouble selling their produce, and the produce were deliberately left unharvested. The supply chain was broken. The conventional supply chain was smallholders would then be connected to middlemen who would then be connected to larger middlemen who would then bring it to consumers. So these are some of the pictures I went on the ground during the movement control order in Sabah. So you can see pictures of vegetables being left to rot because there is no market. But at the same time, there are not enough vegetables in the stalls where vegetables would have been routinely sold. Contract farmers for supermarkets, however, were not affected because their supply chain was not broken. However, the problem was in most Southeast Asian societies, at least half or slightly over half of them do not purchase their fresh agriculture produce, their food, from supermarkets and hypermarkets. So there was a price drop in March and April. Fields were not replanted because they might not necessarily have enough resources to replant them, and price increased significantly. So with price increase, the most vulnerable sections of society, those who lost their jobs during MCOs, were very much affected. This news article shows 80% of plunge in vegetable sales during the initial period of the movement control orders. So let's talk about strategic partnerships going forward. So these are some of the pictures of work that we have done and we are currently doing during the movement control orders. We are looking at alternative supply chain using digital technology. A little bit more about that later on what are the challenges when we use digital technology for smallholder farmers, particularly in rural areas. We look at agriculture technology and extension for agriculture extension for smallholder farmers. Usually, agriculture extensions or know-hows are provided by government agencies which are tasked to look into these activities in all our countries. But during a pandemic, these kind of activities were curtailed. But at the same time, large numbers of farmers are left with large amount of harvest and they do not know what to do with them. So going forward, we probably need to think about extending agriculture extension technology to more farmers so that they could increase the shelf life and prolong the shelf life of their harvest. Then we look at NGOs, non-governmental agencies, academia, government agency partnerships, cooperatives, corporate social responsibilities. I will share with you some of the examples that are currently happening in our countries. All these are done to increase the livelihoods of smallholder farmers because they employ a large segment of our society. And if their income level falls, at the end of the day, it's not only the consumer or the society at large who will be suffering food insecurity, the smallholder farmer, the communities themselves would not be able to afford some of the necessities in life. So these are the alternative supply chain. The three pictures I've got here are farm-to-table initiatives in Thailand. The first one here at the top right-hand side would be an initiative that is pre-existing the COVID-19. These two pictures here. So consumers can buy a mystery box from farmer cooperatives and they will be delivered via the Thai postal system. They are, as you could see, the fruits and the vegetables are those that have a slightly longer shelf life, so it could be couriered or posted. So let's look at the alternative supply chain. In most of our countries, we plant predominantly wet paddy. So these type of rice are usually subjected to government-controlled monopolies. But Many of our societies also plant hill rice, which are not subjected to the same marketing conditions. And we have smallholder farmers of fruits and vegetables, whether they plant it via conventional land agriculture or whether they plant it via hydroponic methods. And we have another group of fishermen and aquaculture producers. So traditionally, they would have been connected to consumers, to society at large via middlemen. But we are trying out an alternative supply chain of what we call niche customers. They are not niche in any way, but they're niche in the fact that they are tech savvy. They're very willing and prepared to do purchases online, choose their vegetables and fruits online, and do online payment and have the trust that the system will serve them well. So we will try and match produce and customers using apps or social media. And we are trying all these at the moment. Some of the produce are received or are sent via existing e-hailing services. So we have a lot of researchers looking at what are the pros and cons of these e-hailing services, whether they are affordable, whether they are socially acceptable. We also have cooperatives delivering produce directly to customers. We also have taxi or bus couriers delivering, and consumers pay a minimal 5 ringgit, or 5 ringgit is the equivalent of almost $2. And we are trying to look at postal couriers. We know that in Thailand that has been successful. So this is agriculture technology and extension for smallholder farmers. The Venn diagram shows new food products, shelf life extension, and increased livelihoods purposes. So we're looking at how we better repurpose, or we better treat, or we have better post-harvest technologies. We have better ways of preserving nutrients for excess harvest, for indigenous edible plants versus very common, like vegetables that you'd often find on supermarket shelves. But all Southeast Asian countries have a large collection of underutilized indigenous edible plants. People, especially in urban areas, could be persuaded to potentially consider having them instead of cultivated crops. We also are lacking behind in local knowledge and local tradition. So we have projects looking at combining traditional knowledge and entrepreneurship in farming communities. We are trying to help farming communities to extend shelf life of agriculture produce, to increase food security. We are trying to do climate modeling with crop cycles, because what happens without climate modeling is that when a movement control order is announced, we're looking at hydroponic and aquaponic farming, looking at how to reduce the cost of starting this kind of farms. We're looking at loan for facilities for farmers. We're looking at digital infrastructure in farming communities. This is very important because in farming communities, which are predominantly rural, in Southeast Asian countries, digital infrastructure is sometimes non-existent, sometimes not very reliable. So we talk about digital farming. One of the major Achilles heel is, whilst it looks good for urban consumers, it might not be good for the people who produce those vegetables and those farm produce. So these are some of the initiatives, partnerships with NGOs. So the first one was Our Farm, is an AirAsia digital marketing, digital agriculture marketing. And then you have Langit. Langit is working with smallholder farmers in Sabah and Sarawak, looking at selling directly via an online platform to customers all over the world. This is Fresh Foods from BKK. This is a Thai initiative. And this is using traditional coffee drying technology to increase the livelihood of smallholder farmers in Sabah, Malaysia. And this is looking at cabbage floss. So during MCOs, we have plenty of cabbage. They were left to rot. Nobody earns an income out of it. So our researchers used local tradition, local knowledge, worked with them in terms of food safety, food quality standards, worked with them in terms of retention of nutritional quality, and they are now successfully selling these cabbage floss online. So these are some of the challenges. I'm mindful of the time, so I'll just go through them rather quickly with them. We could discuss about this if anyone's interested. Some of the challenges are nutritional value of food might decrease with certain processing methods. Preservation methods might increase fat, salt, and sugar intake of consumers. Agriculture extension has to be made into an acceptable new normal for most farmers. Sustainable food production, climate modeling with crop cycle is very difficult for communities to accept that kind of thing. Inability to purchase access is still a problem. Disbursement of emergency aid to citizens, there are geographical challenges, and there are challenges with non-citizens. Southeast Asia has, depending on country, quite a large number of migrant communities or irregular migrant communities. We need to talk about impact on smallholder farmers, informal marketplace, migrants. There is a need to increase national food security and regional cooperation. There is a real need to tackle digital poverty. There is a need to have a sustainable supply chain model. And this is the way forward, depending on which economic model countries are more comfortable with, and there are differences. Strategic partnerships could be largely government-funded programs. It could be largely private initiative-funded program. Malaysia is somewhere between these two poles. There is a very large room for university, for academics to better engage with society, doing translational research. The unfortunate thing is, in the past, academia is rather good in working in building the largest silos, the tallest silos, but not necessarily communicating with our stakeholders. So I'd like to finish with this acknowledgement slide. This is some of the researchers in UMS Agri Solutions talking to community members. And I'd also like to acknowledge the ASEAN Food Science and Nutrition Network that was from the first seminar in Singapore last year. We hope that we can see each other again next year. And lastly, I'd like to thank University Malaysia Sabah. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yasmin, for showing us that once again that united we stand and divided we fall. We request the audience to share their question in the Q&A box. The questions will be addressed by the panelists during the panel discussion.
We now move on to the expert sharing session, where we are going to try to get recipes for success in terms of innovation. So we first have Mr. Ashok Vasudevan, co-founder and CEO for Seesaw Singapore and chairman of Tasty Bite Eatables Limited. Mr. Ashok also co-founded AST Omni, a US and India-based strategy consulting firm. Ashok Vasudevan graduated in agricultural sciences from Bangalore and received his business education from the Bajaj Institute of Management in Mumbai and the Harvard Business School as well. So in his 30 years career, he has been both an entrepreneur and a corporate executive as well. He is involved in several non-profit organizations in India and in US. He's a distinguished professor of international entrepreneurship and is a member of the advisory council of Great Lakes Institute of Management in Chennai, India. Ashok and his wife Meera were jointly presented the 2014 Indian American Achiever Award by Global Organization of People of Indian Origin. We are very happy to have Mrs. Meera Vasudevan with us today, I guess. And we now invite Mr. Ashok to address the audience. Mr. Ashok, the stage is now yours.
Thank you, Sangeeta. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you fine.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Sangeeta. Thank you, Jaya. I'm honored you invited me to participate. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You know, it's never easy to stand in front of such cognitive vigor of so many PhDs. I can see almost a couple of hundred, all of them in one room. So I guess I'm a bit grateful that I'm doing this virtually, because I myself always think of this. I've always wanted to be a scientist, but somehow wasn't good enough, and along the way just stumbled and landed up becoming an entrepreneur instead. Actually, my grandfather was a farmer, and my granduncle was a food scientist who founded the CFTRI, the Central Food Technology Research Institute in India. Clearly, I didn't inherit either of their skills. So I stand here today squarely, in between the two. I'll spend the next few minutes sharing with you my entrepreneurial journey, which in many parts has been triggered by my own fascination for both food and science and agriculture. For some reason, I seem to have lost a connection. Can you guys?
Prof, Mr. Ashok, we can hear you fine. You're fine.
Okay, good. So I'm going to talk about three things over the next 10 minutes. The first is how food science kind of developed in parallel with the Green Revolution, the way that I see it, creating both magic and some unintended consequences, which we can argue could have been foreseen. The second is how science helped our business and our entrepreneurial journey. And the third is the way I see the convergence of scientists and entrepreneurs. So let me talk a bit about the Green Revolution and the less talked about food revolution. I know Dr. Paul Teng mentioned a little bit about this, and I want to go back to that later. I went to, like you mentioned, Sangeeta, the UAS in Bangalore for my undergrad just a few years after the Green Revolution got underway. And over the next 50 years, if you look at it, it appears to have created magic across emerging markets of the world, ending famine or the threat of it in dozens of countries. The Green Revolution, yes, created new hybrids, increased yields, improved color, introduced drought and disease resistance in plants, and even increased the size of grains, fruits, and vegetables. This was nothing short of miracle in real life. I graduated in agricultural economics and plant breeding and genetics, left it all behind, turned my back and did my MBA, and then spent the next 15 years in the food corporate world with Unilever and Pepsi in India and the US. I like to say that these two companies, who I still respect deeply, knew how to and taught me to run a good business in food, but not necessarily the business of good food. Let me paint this scenario where Mira, my wife and partner in crime, and I were in the US early 90s to the mid 90s when we started this company. At the time in the US, we saw a country overrun by large food companies. The numbers are plenty. You know most of the brands. We're talking about big, famous, well-known, large food company brands, which had all used food science to enhance texture, color, shelf life, taste, sweetness, and reduce costs. So for most companies, obviously, they were pleased at the outcome because their revenues grew, food inflation was low, consumer preferences for prepared and convenient foods exploded, Wall Street was thrilled, market cap of food companies skyrocketed, investors made out like bandits. It's true. New factories came up, employment in the food industry exploded. And the QSR industry, with names like McDonald's, KFC, Pizza Hut, Taco Bell, Domino's, Burger King, these were becoming household names across the world and not just in the US. But think about it for a minute. Everybody seems to have benefited, including the insurance companies. Truth be told, the food industry had become unwittingly the suppliers of customers to the healthcare industry. The US is now in the middle of a pandemic. And I don't mean just COVID, but of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and obesity. 70% of America today, 70, is either obese or overweight. 1 in 10 Americans have diabetes. 1 out of every 4 deaths is due to cardiovascular disease. Let me put this in perspective. Every 36 seconds, someone in America dies of heart disease. You know, it's easy to blame our genes, but we know the truth. It's because of our diet. And we as consumers have allowed ourselves to be deeply influenced by the food industry. You know, I'd like to actually think if all of these, if anybody had cared to look as outcomes, might have seen these way back in 1994. I know, Paul, you referred to genetically modified foods, and I'll give you a staggering statistics that chills me every time I visit. Today, 70% of the foods sold in the US supermarket grocery business, which by the way, this year is $680 billion, are genetically modified, GMO foods, 70%. So I guess even miracles have unintended consequences. The truth be told, the brutal truth, consumers are sick, the planet is warmer, and the farmers remain poor. So let me move on to a less depressing piece and talk about how actually science influenced our journey. We started our entrepreneurial career in Stamford, Connecticut, incubating Tasty Bite, a natural food company, in the mid-90s with my wife, Meera, with $5,000 of capital and our dining table as our first office furniture. I believe we are what we eat. Our health, our wellness, our emotions, our choice of friends, and even who we invite home for dinner are all driven by the choices we make in our foods. I've been driven by this belief that we and you as food industry professionals hold the wellness of consumers in the palm of our hands. Equally, I'm persuaded that food science has evolved since the 70s and since the launch of the Green Revolution. And we no longer need to rely on Codex Alimentaria and the 2,500 plus chemicals we use in food with artificial flavors and colors and synthetics to deliver on texture or great tasting food, just to keep the cost down. I actually think of Tasty Bite as an example of this simple truth. We were by no means alone. It was a movement. The natural and organic food industry was now real. Way back in 1994, we identified 3 mega trends. Many of them are true till today. The first mega trend was what we called health and natural, where consumers were becoming increasingly conscious about what they put in their mouth. This is also when the FDA had for the first time introduced mandatory food labeling on all food packs. The tobacco lobby had been, the anti-tobacco lobby had become extremely active and the tobacco industry was slammed. We could see the green shoots of the organic industry. This was megatrend number 1. The second megatrend is what we called convenience. This was driven by a simple statistic that in the 1980s, decade of the 80s, more women went to work in America than in the previous 4 decades combined, except the Second World War. So we knew consumers would have less time to cook at home and therefore would lean towards more convenience foods. And the third mega trend was the changing demographic in America due to migration, not just from Latin America, but also from Asia. So we obviously and easily predicted that food preferences would change and great taste would prevail over choice of cuisine. All these three mega trends of natural, convenient, specialty, which Dr. Roy was a little bit like your Venn diagram, were aided deeply by science. In our case, specifically in the application of the retort technology to food. You know, many of you here, actually all of you here are food scientists who will recall the French chef and confectioner Nicolas Appert, who wrote the famous cookbook. In fact, the world's first cookbook on modern food preservation method. And he heralded the birth of food science. And he was the precursor to canning technology, a process that, by the way, some people still refer to as appertization. Amazingly, he achieved this feat knowing nothing about bacteria or food pathogens. In fact, Louis Pasteur was not to appear with the next preservation technology, pasteurization, for another 100 years. So this simple technology allowed us to create ready-to-eat foods in a flexible can without the use of preservatives. Sterilization ensured food safety. Truth be told, while we call this NASA technology, because NASA had used this technology as food for astronauts, the science was more than 200 years old. So we easily position Tasty Bite in this Venn diagram of natural, convenient, specialty. And we made a simple promise, which till today, every employee, the 1,500 employees who go into the factory, still state that we will not put into Tasty Bite what we will not put into our mouths. Now, let me come to the third part, which is more relevant to you folks here, the importance and the convergence of scientists and entrepreneurs. The differences between the two sometimes appear stark or might appear stark to you. You know, science I think of as the relentless pursuit of rational inquiry. So you make assumptions that you call hypotheses, and you spend the next few months, more likely years, and sometimes decades, testing them. But here's the rub. When we find these answers quickly to these hypotheses, we feel guilty that we haven't asked the right question, or our hypothesis is not profound enough because we found the answer too quickly. So we ask a different question and go down a rabbit hole of relentless inquiry. Pretty soon, this journey becomes the destination with no end in sight, but the inquiry itself. Yeah, there is pleasure, I guess, and even poetry in this process, but societal gratification is delayed because the scientist is not yet ready to offer her unfinished product to the world. Now, entrepreneurs, on the other hand, are painkillers. And on occasion, I think of them as pleasure providers. They're comfortable starting with half-baked ideas, half-baked solutions, and improvising on the go. I mean, perfection is never the goal. And contrary to popular belief, neither is wealth creation their goal. But I see more similarities than differences between scientists and entrepreneurs. Sometimes I think of scientists as entrepreneurs in disguise, because you both imagine a future, then truly chase uncertainty and believe you're solving societal problems in the long run. But I've often wondered, and Dr. Oy mentioned this, why enough scientists have not embraced entrepreneurship more fully. Why do we think of multidisciplinary only in the field of science and collaboration? If I'm a nutritionist, I'm happy to join forces with a biochemist, even with a plant physiologist. But our interdisciplinary experiment stops there. Why wouldn't I collaborate with a marketing professional or a supply chain expert? Why does the multidisciplinary collaborative spirit not embrace disciplines outside of science and into the realm of business? You know, most entrepreneurs fail not because they are not driven, but because they often lack domain expertise. This is exactly why I'm persuaded that scientists have a significantly better shot at creating successful enterprise, if only they're able to choose their partners wisely. You know, in business, I like to say we don't use science only when it makes business sense. It is our responsibility to make business sense out of good science, because I believe all good theory is practical. It might appear like a logical career move for many of you here today to transition from your labs to a corporate R&D environment or to a government lab. It also might be a good time to pause and consider the alternatives and the other useful applications of science and the work that you're doing, which is super important. It is true that not all large food corporates produce franken foods or make consumers sick. But honestly, you will find it hard to truly justify that they make us healthier either. I believe you hold the wellness of the consumers in the palm of your hands and have the ability to create enterprises that will deliver on that promise, that we are what we eat. You will be pleased to know that almost 60 million jobs in America, or 50% of the total workforce, was created not by the government, not by the corporate sector, but by the entrepreneurs only last year. I believe scientists are uniquely equipped because the future is being created in your labs. Sometimes you may not even know it, which is why when we set up CSAW, which is an acronym, CSAW, Center for the Spread of Affordable Wellness, we just started on this journey post Tasty Bite when we moved from the US and relocated here to Singapore a couple of years ago. We said we want to imagine a world where we see three things. Farmers prosper, consumers eat healthy, and food companies must transform. This will be impossible to do without all of you on this conference. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. Ashok, for inspiring us. And probably we shouldn't curtail ourselves with so much of perfectionism, and we should stop looking inward so much and start looking outward a bit as well. Thank you very, very much, Mr. Ashok. Megan, I pass it over to you.
Thank you, Sangeeta. To inspire us now, we have with us Mr. Azran Osman Rani. Mr. Azran builds disruptive new businesses that challenge the status quo. His current adventure, Naluri, is a digital health therapeutic company that uses AI tools to augment professional care for chronic diseases and mental health to make it more accessible and affordable. He is part of the startup team at iFlix, an internet television service that was launched in 2015 and was scaled up to 20 million users across 20 countries. Previously, Azran also pioneered the long-haul, low-cost airline model as the founding CEO of AirAsia X. Azran held previous leadership roles in Astro All Asia Network, the Kuala Lumpur Stock Exchange, and at the Miskinski and Company. He holds master degree in management science and engineering and a bachelor degree in electrical engineering, both from Stanford University. He is currently an industry advisory board member at International Medical University and the Sunway University Business School. He mentors high-growth companies for Entrepreneurial and invests in technology startups. And most importantly, Mr. Azran is an Ironman triathlete. Over to you, Mr. Azran.
Oh, thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Megan. And thank you, everyone, for joining me. Essentially, if you were to look at the last 15 of my 25-year career, I've been building businesses that challenge the status quo, from highly regulated, capital-intensive businesses like the airline industry to fast-moving internet technology businesses and now healthcare. The common denominator has been to look at the status quo and say, how can we make these services much more affordable, much more accessible, and more convenient to the mass market populations, especially in emerging markets? And what attracted me to healthcare, of course, is that we are faced with a very, very large problem. Across ASEAN and certainly beyond the Asia region, the percentage of our populations that are affected, the cost to the economy, and more importantly, the rate of growth of medical costs as arising from healthcare burdens is staggering at 3 to 4 times the rate of GDP growth in these economies. Now, specifically, when I look at healthcare, these are the 3 main problems that I see, as someone from the outside, although my team at Naluri comprises of, 3 PhDs and 1 medical doctor. So we combine our collective experience and to try to see how can we reimagine the way healthcare is delivered, not just from hospitals and clinics, but even this telehealth, telemedicine model. We think it's time to think beyond that. So specifically, these models are reactive and transactional, meaning people wait to get sick before they reach out to get help. And help is often transactional. It's episodic. It is per consultation, per treatment, per prescription. But as we all know, with chronic conditions, whether it's diabetes, heart disease, and cancer on one hand, or depression, anxiety, and stress on the other, you can't fix it with a single consultation. You need a structured program that's ongoing. But then how do we make it affordable and accessible to the mass market population? Secondly, healthcare has become so specialized that it's become siloed. You see a cardiologist, she's only going to talk to you about your heart. You see a gastroenterologist, it's about your gut. You see a nutritionist, it's about your food. And you see a psychologist, it's about your mental health. But the reality is these things are deeply interconnected. And it's time we figure out how can we bring together multidisciplinary care in a truly convenient and accessible manner. And last, that we find, something that the healthcare industry really needs to look at it is a lot of it is activity-based, right? Payers, the insurers, governments, corporate employers are paying for an activity, whether that activity is a consultation, a treatment, a prescription, or even digital apps that count steps or calories or number of hours that you sleep instead of actual outcomes. What if we could imagine a healthcare industry where healthcare was delivered based on actual results? If people don't see their blood sugar come down or their weight come down, they don't get paid. Right? That is the model that we imagine in the future. And the starting point of that is to really try to bring a much more quantitative approach to healthcare, right? And that is why for us, the research that we do is hugely important, and we'll continue to invest significantly in clinical research. But essentially what we do is, for example, even with mental health, we take a quantitative approach to say, let's measure levels of depression, anxiety, and stress. And if we could provide a digital intervention over a 4-month period, can we see significant clinical outcomes as a result of that? These same people who were experiencing high levels of depression, anxiety, and stress, unsurprisingly, also had high HbA1c blood sugar. They were overweight, high cholesterol, and high blood pressure. And similarly, we also want to measure the outcomes as a result of this. And if a digital therapeutic, right, an app that doesn't involve any medication can, for example, bring down HbA1c by about 0.6, that's about an equivalent effect as pharmacological treatments. So, and this, we're only still at the starting point of a new way of delivering healthcare that moves away from just, continued medication that doesn't actually lead to reversal of the condition. It just somehow suppresses the symptoms. But more important than numbers, I'm always motivated by the lives that we can transform. People who, once they can learn to take control of their lives, really have been able to significantly change their outcomes. So what is Naluri? And Naluri is an app. It's available now not only in Malaysia, but also in Singapore, Indonesia, and soon other ASEAN countries. But imagine an app where you have your own personal healthcare team, right? Your own psychologist, your own dietitian, your own fitness coach, pharmacists, and medical doctors. But we even added executive coaches and financial planners because those are the 2 biggest stress triggers in our lives. There's no point advising someone to eat healthier if they feel overwhelmed with personal financial stress or work-related stress. But chat alone, which is our main interface, can be very cumbersome if, as a professional, I've got to ask you a lot of questions, I've got to explain to you a lot of concepts. And so what we did was we built a digital curriculum of mini bite-sized content that coaches can then assign their users over 5 minutes when they're free in a day, whether it's a diagnostic related module like what are the stress triggers in your life, or something that explains what's the difference between good fats and bad fats, good carbs and bad carbs, or what is diabetes and hyperglycemia versus hypoglycemia. By putting it in small bite-sized chunks, it allows us to create much more efficiency in the coaching process. We then added a photo-based and AI-augmented food journal, because while most people can tell you keeping a food diary they'll give up after 2 days. What most Malaysians certainly are very good at is our cameras on our phone eat before us, right? And so we created a simple Instagram-like layout where when you take a picture, the AI can recognize the difference between a thosai, a chapati versus a roti canai, but still a qualified clinical dietitian gives you personalized guidance, because if you're starting from a hypertensive but underweight position, your advice is going to be different from someone who's overweight and diabetic. And instead of confusing people with calories and macronutrients, we simplified it using a red, yellow, green traffic light system, which incidentally we developed together with Prof. Winnie. And therefore, to be able to display the progress of a user based on the mix of green, yellow, and red, and so they can see whether they're making better food choices over time. For our psychologists, we use a similar thought journal to use simple emoticons to get people to log in the emotions so that we can see patterns developing over time. And right now, under COVID-19, we're seeing a lot of anger, we're seeing a lot of sadness, and we're seeing a lot of fear, right? And that's why we can then apply digital cognitive behavioral therapy to get to the root causes of these anger, fear, and sadness. And lastly, when coaches start talking to our users, what are the behavioral actions that you want to take? I can log it in, whether it's a diet related things like, drinking water or eating a healthy snack, or an exercise related module, or even medication, because medication adherence is a major issue in this part of the world. But if we can send reminders, and then the member can then say, yes, I did it, no, I did not, this allows the coaches to monitor their ongoing progress rather than wait, for example, a 4-month period before I see blood test results. And finally, those with metabolic conditions, we do provide a Bluetooth connected weighing scale. You step on it, the app's automatically updated, and so you can see your weight progress over time, or you've got a glucometer to track your glucose readings, or your step counters from your Apple Watch or Google Fit, to allow, again, the coaches to then track all of these metrics. But all of these 6 features that I shared, what's more important is, what do we do with this data? What we're building is a behavior change prediction algorithm. So everything that I showed you was on this left-hand side, the inputs that you type. We take that data and we create psychological or behavioral constructs to quantify mindsets and readiness to change and resilience, so that coaches know who needs what help when in a more precise manner. So for example, readiness to change being displayed in a quantitative level is very new to a lot of health coaches. So they can see when someone starts, they may be initially motivated. The first roadblock or obstacle they face, they're going to go down. That's where I, as a coach, need to spend a lot more time with that user. But once that user is self-motivated, he's going on track, I can back off. I don't need to spend as much time with that user. And so it really allows us to prioritize at a deeply personal level. And just from the chat context, the text that you type, the verbs and nouns and adjectives that you use, we create an emotional sentiment index. This is an actual 32-year-old female Malay woman, right, who initially in the course of a 4-month Naluri program, it was basically a 0 level of emotional intensity, because she was just talking about her diet or exercise. But suddenly, small subtle changes caused that index to plummet. And we reached out to her rather than waiting for her to reach out for help. Turns out she was saying, thank you for reaching out to me. My husband's been traveling a lot. I'm stuck home with my kids. Kids are ill. I don't know what to do. Pressure at work. My boss is on my case. She was contemplating suicide ideation, and she did not reach out for help. But by starting to get better at detecting these subtle changes, we can transform healthcare so that we are much more proactive rather than wait for people to reach out and get help. And so fundamentally for us, right, in our region, the single biggest problem we have is that healthcare professionals are too far and few in number, right? Whether you look at mental health care professionals, psychiatrists, and psychologists, we have less than 1/50th the number per population that you see in Australia, Hong Kong, or the UK. And similarly, even with true qualified clinical dietitians, right, who can really understand what the nutritional requirements are for those who are wrestling with chronic conditions. And so if we can use tech to take someone and amplify the number of patients that they can reach out by 10-fold, we believe we can make a much bigger impact on society when they can get personalized care very conveniently on the device at a much more affordable rate. And so with that, I just want to thank you again for allowing me to share this. And I would definitely be interested to collaborate with people, because we're continuing to invest a lot more in clinical research across these countries in ASEAN, because we do believe that food and culture and language are deeply personal. And so we need to be much more tailored with our data and our analysis to shape much more accurate predictions of human behavior. So with that, thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Azran. Very insightful, very interesting presentation. Thank you so much. Over to you, Sangeeta, for the Q&A.
Okay, so we now move on to the most interesting session for today, and it's going to be the panel discussion where we are going to try to pose the questions that we have received from the audience. Let's take the first question. This question is for Professor Teng. So the audience member here says, thank you for your very interesting presentation delivered in the session. During this pandemic, the food insecurity is commonly found due to low food affordability. In accessing the food, the cash transfer program was launched by the Indonesia's government to assist the purchasing power in addition to the urban farming, and it is commonly found within the community. From your expert opinion, how is this program and movement useful in assisting the resilience of the community?
Okay, I'm not an expert in what's happening in Indonesia, but let me kind of give a contextualized answer. I think the question really is about resilience under challenging times, especially at the household level. I think we do know that at the household level, food insecurity results when any of those 4 dimensions that Yasmin mentioned in her talk are actually upset. If food is not available, if at the household level, if you can't buy food from anywhere at all, that causes a lot of stress, insecurity. And this happened in the early days, in Singapore anyway, of the COVID-19, when people cleared all the supermarket shelves from panic buying, hoarding. So those who came later had no access at all. Okay, so that's one cause of insecurity, kind of the purchase or inability to purchase, availability. Second, of course, is this also links to fiscal access, which I think Yasmin also mentioned. Then the affordability links to economic access. You're right. I think during COVID-19 and other disruptive, factors to food security, when people lose their jobs, especially daily wage workers and so on, they don't have the economic purchasing power. Okay, so yes, that indeed causes, food insecurity, and governments have compensated in different ways through different kinds of safety net measures. I think the payment in kind, is just one of them really. There are also other ways like, voluntary organizations stepping in with food donations, and we saw a big rise of those in several countries in ASEAN region. Volunteers stepping up, food banks and so on, to help make up for this difference. Yeah. Now, there are other ways to actually make up for this, lack of food by self-production. Households being encouraged to grow their own food, and we even see this in condominiums, in apartments. Like even I myself, I grow snap beans in a pot which I can harvest. Examples like that. Then there's the community garden approach, which was practiced during the Second World War in Europe, for example. Again, we're seeing this happen in several countries. Communities at the barrio level, the kampung level coming together to actually share kind of growing of food. And of course, one of the other aspects that I think, again, Yasmin mentioned is this thing about foraging, getting food from the wild, like in Sabah, Sarawak, the paku, the wild fern, just one example, of a vegetable that can be foraged. Yeah? So there's really no single kind of answer or solution really. Urban farming must be contextualized in the context of, let's say, household farming. Certainly, I think urban farming is something that urban households try to do, even though with limited means. Yeah? But even those in the countryside can practice their own household farming to provide their own, kind of supplies of food. And this goes, back to the discussion of food sovereignty, which I think a lot of kind of people live in the countryside can really practice a lot more food sovereignty than those who live in the urban areas can. That's my kind of short answer to your question. It's actually a very deep question. I'll be very happy to to engage in a dialogue with you on this, Lestari, through the internet, through email. Yeah. So thank you. I don't want to take up too much time. Thanks, Sangeeta. Yeah.
Okay, the second question we have is for Dr. Yasmin. How can nutritious food be made more available and affordable?
Thank you, Megan. Nutritious food is actually available I agree that we have an issue of affordability, and this is not unique to Southeast Asia. Data from Europe, from America, from Australia, New Zealand demonstrate similar things. So one of the ways is to look at home economics again. Those of us who are my age or older might have had a home economics class. Then home economics kind of like fell out of fashion somewhat. But I suspect that we should pay attention to home economics, because with home economics, households, children are taught to be able to prepare their own nutritious meal. So that is one way where we could prepare better nutritious meals for households. Prof. Paul spoke about urban farming. There must be interest. There must also be know-how. There are people, I know people who are very interested in urban farming, or for that matter, rural farming around their households, in their surroundings, but they don't have the knowledge how to farm. They don't have knowledge of pest control and whatnot. So I think it is also back to home economics, because home economics would also have curriculum on how to plant your normal food and manageable crops. Yeah, thank you.
The next question is from Dr. Judy from CMU Recfon. Hi, Judy, nice to have you here. And this question is for all panelists, so you could take it in the order that you would like to answer it. And she asks that, she says that her organization is working with schools, and she would like to hear insights from all panelists on how we should bring this topic to public education agenda. So who would like to go first?
Let me make a start then, Paul, here. I would imagine that there's already a lot of education going in schools about food and nutrition. I mean, the few countries that I've, been associated with, I've seen that happening. I thought that what Judy really meant by public education is really the broader public. To me, that's more challenging, I think, rather than schools, because schools are a confined environment with fixed curriculum and so on and so forth, And it takes effort, but you can actually influence what schools teach, either through projects or part of the academic curriculum. Now, educating the general public, I think, is a lot more difficult, frankly, and because of the tremendous changes in the food diet, health landscape, I think that's where we need to focus our effort itself, the masses, so to speak. Now, I know that in some countries, there are public organizations, private, especially, they're already doing this on their own accord, really, and also developing apps, education apps on a proper diet and so on. But I know just one small example, in Singapore, the Health Promotion Board comes up with the perfect plate, in terms of what to eat and so on. And others have taken those perfect plates and expanded on them in a micro manner. I'll just share that very quickly, yeah.
Yasmin, would you like to take this?
Yes, continuing from where Prof. Paul left off, and from where I left off, it's back to self-sufficiency. So at all levels of society, I believe most people in Southeast Asia, fortunately, are able to attend schools now. And I know that in the countries that I've worked with, in Malaysia, I have friends in Singapore, Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, Timor-Leste. So I know that food and nutrition is already embedded in the curriculum. So how do you promote lifelong learning? How do you promote practicing of knowledge in food and nutrition? I think there should be more space for public reinforcements of such messages. Nutritionists and dietitians are fighting a losing battle against, I would not say all food companies. I would say some food companies who are marketing foods that are more energy dense and less nutrient dense. But those foods are delicious and those foods are cheaper. So for one reason or another, children who grew up with food and nutrition in their syllabus, in their curriculum, are somehow not practicing them. So I think there should be increased efforts by the public sector to somehow think about how to disseminate such information, because we are up against advertisements, and advertisements, our friends in the advertising industry are very good. So I think we should get our health and nutrition messages into the capable hands of advertisers as well.
Now, let me just add to what Paul and Yasmin have been saying. I have a interesting take. If you remember Jamie Oliver, the chef who's since opened up a restaurant here, he made a storm. He's not liked in much of America for a simple reason that he had a TV serial there, and he went around the country showing cauliflower and eggplant or cauliflower and cabbage to students to say, what is this? And the students didn't know a cauliflower from a cabbage or from an eggplant to an okra. And this he did on national television across the world. So the point is extremely well made that we take certain knowledge for granted, but when we actually go and look at the curriculum, there is no reason for these kids to know. This is the first. But the second is, before you start getting depressed, I'll give you something else which will make you pause a little bit more and even get more depressed. It takes 10 years for a student to become a doctor in America, maybe a little less in other countries, but it takes full 10 years of academic curriculum. Here's the horror story. You will not believe this, but this is true. Out of these 10 years of academic rigor, there is only 10 hours of contact and nutrition classes for doctors in America. So why are we going to schools? We can cut across the whole society. So that's the second. The third message for me is important. You can get the advertising agencies in, Yasmin, but I would keep the corporates out of this education program. Let science speak, not the corporates. And let scientists learn to use the advertising agencies and market research agencies to craft the message. It's an important question. Thank you, though.
Yes, I agree. Scientists need to work outside of our silos. We need to work with marketers. We need to work with entrepreneurs. And we definitely can work a lot on our communication.
Mr. Azran, would you like to have a take on it? Or?
I'll keep business out of this.
Okay.
Okay. The next question is posed to Mr. Azran. Were comparison made to compare efficacy of digital therapy or consultation versus the conventional or traditional physical session with healthcare professionals? For example, in terms of compliance to medication.
So as I replied to that question, we do have an ongoing randomized controlled trial with the National Heart Institute specifically on that. So hopefully by next year, we'll be able to publish those findings. And I think we need to do a lot more of that. So we're committed to keep investing in proper clinical trials.
Okay.
Actually, we have a lot of questions, and I don't think we are going to be able to answer all of them. And they are such fantastic questions, and I just wish we had more time. So here is a question from Professor Jaya Henry to all panelists. How can disruptive technologies also focus on developing low cost by high nutritive values for low income countries, I guess? So would anybody like to take on that? Disruptive technologies for low income countries, would that be a possibility for developing high nutritive value foods, or even for sustainable healthcare?
I'll give it a shot because it's an important piece and it's consistent with the vision of at least our business. when we use the term Center for the Spread of Affordable Wellness, we are baked into the brand name itself, the affordability quotient, which means we are talking about the entire pyramid, not just the top of it or not only the bottom of it. Because wellness cuts through the whole pyramid. The amazing truth is food, the more we process foods and the further it travels, the more expensive it is. Making affordable food nutritious with high nutritional density is actually very easy. All it needs is not to do much with it. What we try to do is to intervene, and in the intervention, we create havoc. So I'll give you some simple examples. You take orange juice and you juice an orange, it's very inexpensive. But the moment you add a debittering technology, the debittering technology is a $10 million technology, and all it does is remove some natural bitterness from orange, and what you get is a more expensive orange juice. Coffee. You take the caffeine out of coffee, so the process of taking it out is more energy intensive, and decaf coffee becomes more expensive than coffee. Take milk, lactose-free milk. Milk has lactose, you spend energy taking out the lactose, and lactate, which is lactose-free milk, becomes more expensive. This is true for low fat, this is true for decaf. Across the system, if only the food industry realized that you don't need to do large factories with power SKUs that are dependent on this old principle known as the economies of scale, plays havoc with the nutritional density for consumers. It does good for their profits, supposedly. But the truth is, if you remove the theory of the economies of scale and took smaller manufacturing / food preparation, food kitchens, not food factories, across, and bring the consumer and the farmer closer and closer, which luckily, in some bizarre way, COVID has ensured, then you will see greater affordability at the bottom of the pyramid. So I'm very persuaded that the food industry will change its ways and become smaller, more nimble, more local. And the consumer and the farmer can come together without too much processing.
I might want to add to that. Often when we talk about lowering the cost, we only think about what we pay at the cashier's till, but we don't think about what is the impact on the local economy. I agree with Mr. Ashok that we might want to move away from large processing plants. And yes, they have economies of scales, but whatever price you pay at the cashier's till, it's not benefiting the local economy. At best, it's benefiting one or two salespersons who represent the company, which is headquartered probably a few thousand miles away. So what we are trying in my state, in Sabah, is we're looking at transferring technology from academia in collaboration with the various government agencies and NGOs to the very farmers or to the very community who are producing those fresh produce, minimally processed, and we could give it instructions, we could share how to make those products safe in terms of food quality and safety. Yes, they don't have the economies of scales, but the price would be slightly higher, but we have to bear in mind that whatever slightly higher price that you pay, the farmers will be getting the profit, who will then be able to plow their profit back into the local economy. So I think we should move away from thinking about what is the cheapest item on sale, but rather where does the profit go to?
Yasmin, I want to add you said it beautifully. In fact, we have a slogan in our newsletter. You may pay a little bit more to your point, but we say pay the farmer, not the pharmacy. You will end up saving a ton load of money.
So I think it's kind of getting a bit late and people may need to leave. And I'm very sorry that we have to end this, and we have so many beautiful questions. We'll try to get back to them, if we are able to. So we have now come to the end of this vibrant panel discussion. And so, Megan, I pass it over to you. We are going to have somebody interesting to come up now.
Okay, now we shall invite Professor Dr. Kumar Henry, Senior Advisor, Singapore Institute of Food and Biotechnology Innovation, to give us the closing remarks. Over to you, Prof. Jaya.
Yeah, thank you very much. What can I say? I'm just bamboozled by your four speakers. So firstly, a big round of applause to Paul, Yasmin, Ashok, and Azran. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation, not only erudite, but stimulating, and above all, so interconnected. So thank you very much. So I just want to spend a few minutes of my time just to share the excitement of this new initiative that, as Winnie mentioned, is only about 16 months old, but I can see from the way it's been panning out, it's a wonderful initiative, and thank you very much to everybody. Just a few quick remarks. Next slide, please. Somebody's doing the slides, or am I doing the slides? Sangeeta?
Prof, we are moving the slides for you.
Oh, bless you. Yeah. So I just wanted to bring us all back to what's being said by all four speakers in different perspectives. And I want to remind ourselves that we in Asia are surrounded by a food enigma and an Asian paradox. Why do I say that? Because it is ironic that no time in history have we produced such an abundance amount of food in the world, and yet in Asia, 500 million people go hungry every day, and nearly 1 million of us are overweight or obese. The second point I want to also point out to you is that much of the global narrative on nutrition has focused and centered around overweight and obesity. Now in Asia, as you all know, being fat is no relevance to the prevalence of type 2 diabetes. 70% of people that got type 2 diabetes in Asia are skinny guys. And therefore, the point I'm making is that the narrative on nutrition and food science is not relevant perhaps directly to the Asian context. The second point I want to remind ourselves that we in Asia are also hugely affected by iron, iodine, vitamin A, zinc, vitamin D deficiency, stunting, and of course diabetics I talked about. And the second paradox is that we've heard Paul and Ashok and many others say that isn't it ironic that Asia being the fastest growing economy, how is it that we still have these severe pockets of malnutrition? What is the access to food? The whole question of sustainability, access to markets, all of these things become a huge challenge to us. Next slide, please. And just to remind you that I want to argue that in Asia, we have a huge global concern of type 2 diabetes, much more significant than obesity. I'm not detracting from the role of obesity, but I think this is a much bigger issue. Next slide, please. And so what we've been doing here in a very small way is to really ask the question, how can this group, being the ambassadors of tomorrow and on which the shoulders of which we are building, look at what is humankind's greatest challenge? How do we access palatable, nutritious, and above all, affordable foods? And I think the second point I want to share with you with great excitement is that Asia is rapidly becoming an epicenter of high quality food and nutrition research. So we don't simply have to go to the textbooks of what's happening in the West to inform and influence our paradigm. And as you know, in Singapore, the government is spending millions of dollars on food and nutrition research. And as you know, in April of this year, we have formed a new center called the Singapore Institute of Food and Biotechnology Innovation, whose executive director, Hazel Koo, is also in the audience, I know, just to show us an example that we mean big business in terms of the science and policy of nutrition. And as Ashok pointed out, that let's also remind that scientists can also become tomorrow's greatest entrepreneurs. So therefore, we now have an enormous responsibility on our shoulders in all of you listening into this event. How do we have policy discussion and to strategize and focus the needs of our region? And therefore, this second IMU A-Star ASEAN Food and Science Network is a simple way to nurture both the scientific and the capacity building in this region. Finally, I want to end by saying, the last slide, please. The last slide is that our vision has been very simple. We want to connect you scientists with all the 10 nations in the ASEAN region so that we have a collective powerful force of intellectual prowess that is unprecedented in this part of the world. Share examples of good practice in food and nutrition, which we've already seen today, and also promote much more South dialogue, which is again an important part of our vision. And last but not least, to focus and address local issues with our regional talent. So last year, those of you attend our first meeting in Singapore, we had Singapore and Malaysia. This time around, we have included Indonesia and Thailand. Thank you so much to our Indonesian and Thai partners for joining in. We will have more. Thank you very much for dialing in. So next year, we plan to have 3 more countries join us, and they will be, I believe, Philippines, Brunei, and Vietnam, and the next year, the last 3, so that in 2 years' time, we will have a brute force of 10 of our global partners in the ASEAN region. So I need to end by saying thank you for this wonderful event. Many people were involved with this. I want to really make a special thank you to the 4 speakers, also to Winnie, who's unfortunately left us for another meeting. Thank you for her supportive role in this. Last but not least, all you participants, but most of all also to the colleagues from IMU, notably Sangeeta and Megan, and many others from IMU who behind the scene have been helping us, but also our 3 staff members who are the early career scientists that we are also keen to nurture, that notably are Sumanto, Stefan, and Kerry. But last but not least, thank you to everybody from all parts of the ASEAN region for joining in. And I hope this is a beginning of a much brighter element for all of us to be thankful and excited about. Thank you, and God bless to everybody.
Thank you, Professor Henry. We will stop working in silos, hopefully, and we will look outside and collaborate a bit more, and we will stop being tied in perfection. So we have taken note of some of the points that we can, as early career researchers, incorporate into our working attitudes. So with that, we come to the end of today's session. Dear participants, thanks for being with us today. We would love to hear your thoughts and comments. Kindly click on the link that's provided in the chat box and provide us your valuable feedback. E-certificates will be emailed to all registered participants. Megan.
Dear participants and ANFSN alumni, we look forward to meeting you at the next event. Bye-bye and have a great evening ahead.
Bye-bye, everyone.